art is.
Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T and by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
A United Nations aid convoy today evacuated 800 Muslim refugees from the Bosnian town of Srebrenica. Among them were dozens wounded when Serb shells pounded the town yesterday, killing at least 56 people, including 15 children. The refugee convoy arrived this evening in the Muslim stronghold of Tuzla. The trucks were covered with tarpaulins to protect the Muslims from Serb youths. UN officials say they have stoned previous refugee convoys. The head of UN refugee operations in Bosnia bitterly denounced the Bosnian Serb army for forcing the Muslims of Srebrenica to choose between transported like cattle or slaughtered like sheep. We'll have more on the Bosnia story later in the program. Judy?
In South Africa, the alleged killer of African National Congress leader Chris Hani appeared in court today and was ordered held until May 12th. He is a white man with ties to right-wing groups. African National Congress supporters protested outside the courthouse, but ANC leader Nelson Mandela pleaded for calm. The government has ordered curfews in several districts where violence has flared after Hani's killing. We'll have more on the story later in the program. Israeli helicopter gunships and artillery pounded several villages in southern Lebanon today. The attacks followed a roadside bombing earlier in the day that killed 3 Israeli soldiers on patrol. 2 others were wounded. The bombing was claimed by the radical Muslim group Hezbollah, which is opposed to the Middle East peace talks. Those talks are set to resume next week in Washington.
Officials in Hanoi have said a newly discovered document about American POWs is a fraud and a fabrication. The document was found in Soviet archives in Moscow. It says the Vietnamese held more than 1,200 U.S. prisoners near the end of the Vietnam War, but a few months after it was allegedly written, they released fewer than 600, saying they were the only U.S. prisoners being held. Vietnamese government officials today blamed the memo on unnamed people who wanted to sabotage a renewal of U.S.-Vietnamese relations. In Washington, Senator Robert Smith, a Republican of New Hampshire and a member of the Select Committee on POWs and MIAs, held a news conference with members of MIA families. He had this to say.
We're here to stand united today in strong opposition to normalization with Vietnam, in strong opposition to relaxing the trade embargo or removing the trade embargo, and certainly in opposition to any loans from the International Monetary Fund or any other international fund to provide funds to the Vietnamese unless and until they've provided the fullest possible accounting for all of our missing.
A State Department spokesman said the document will be the first thing on the U.S. agenda when talks on normalization of relations with Vietnam resume there next week. We'll have more on the story right after the news summary.
The standoff continued today at a prison in southern Ohio. Officials discovered the body of an inmate today, the 7th found since inmates rioted and took over a cell block at the Lucasville, Ohio prison on Sunday. 8 guards are being held hostage by the rebellious prisoners. Inmates used a loudspeaker today to complain about the slow pace of negotiations with authorities.
In economic news, the Commerce Department reported retail sales fell a full % in March. It was the worst decline in more than 2 years. The department said last month's big East Coast blizzard was partly to blame. Administration officials claimed the report highlighted the need for President Clinton's $16 billion economic stimulus plan, which remains blocked by a Republican filibuster in the Senate. Meanwhile, Japan today approved an economic stimulus plan of its own. The $117 billion package is aimed partly at reducing the country's record trade surplus by stimulating domestic consumption of imports. U.S. displeasure over Japan's trade imbalance with the U.S. is expected to be high on the agenda when President Clinton meets with Japan's Prime Minister later this week.
President Clinton helped commemorate Thomas Jefferson's 250th birthday today. The ceremonies were at the Jefferson Memorial in Washington. It was also the 50th anniversary of the dedication of the memorial which is surrounded by the famous cherry blossom trees, currently in full bloom. Mr. Clinton used the opportunity to campaign for his legislative agenda. He drew parallels between Jefferson's philosophy of government and his own policies.
Thomas Jefferson understood that no politician, no government, no piece of paper could do for the American people what they would have to do for themselves. He understood, better perhaps than any of his colleagues, that the people of this country would always have to be not only the protectors of their own liberty, but the agents of their own transformation and change. But he also knew that government must be willing to supply the tools of that change. And that very simply is our task today.
In Charlottesville, Virginia today, former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev attended ceremonies commemorating Jefferson's birthday at the University of Virginia, which Jefferson founded. Gorbachev said Jefferson often inspired him as he tried to bring democratic changes to the Soviet Union.
The Pulitzer Prizes were awarded today. The Washington Post won 3, including one for a pre-election examination of candidate Bill Clinton's record. The Miami Herald won the Public Service Gold Medal for its coverage of Hurricane Andrew. The Pulitzer Prize for Fiction went to Robert Olin Butler for the novel A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain. David McCullough won the Biography Award for his book Truman, and Gary Wills won the General Nonfiction Prize for his study of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
That's it for our summary of the day's top stories. Just ahead on the NewsHour, did Vietnam hide the number of American prisoners of war? What's next for Yugoslavia? We hear from Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Then a report from South Africa on the impact of the weekend assassination of an ANC leader, and an Amai Wallach essay.
We begin tonight with the latest twist in the often twisted tale of the fate of 2,200 U.S. servicemen still missing from the Vietnam War. Resolution of the missing in action issue is the major obstacle to establishing full diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Vietnam, 20 years after the Paris Peace Accords ended the American combat role in that country. President Clinton has just sent a special emissary to Hanoi for more answers on the MIA issue. But over the weekend came a report that Vietnam deliberately misled the U.S. on the number of prisoners it was holding and would return at the end of hostilities in 1973. If verified, that could mean several hundred Americans have since died in captivity or are still being held. The Vietnamese government has denounced the document as a fabrication. It was discovered by a Harvard researcher, Stephen J. Morris, who's working on a book about the war, and that's where we begin our coverage. Dr. Morris, you're joining us from Boston. Describe just how and where you found this document.
I found the document in the archives of the former Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I had been given access as part of a group sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., people working on different aspects of the Cold War. And I was the only one who was working on the history of the Vietnam War. And I should point out that I'm the only person outside the former Communist Party of the Soviet Union who has read these documents on the Vietnam War.
And what were you actually looking for when you found this document?
Well, I wasn't looking for this, to be quite honest. I was looking for interesting information about Vietnamese communist strategy during the war and the conditions inside North Vietnam from the point of view of the Soviet Union, because, of course, they had a very intense and commitment to North Vietnam. They had military advisors, they had KGB people, they had political cadres, and the embassy reports were extremely interesting. And it was in the course of reading some of these documents that I stumbled upon one which had the first revelations about American prisoners of war.
Now, this is a document said to have been written by whom?
It's been written by Lieutenant General Tran Van Quang, who was then the Deputy Chief of Staff of the North Vietnamese Army. And he was giving a report to the Politburo of the Vietnamese Communist Party. In fact, this was not the first document I've read by him. The previous report that he'd written on June 12th, which doesn't deal with the question of prisoners of war, by the way, I have also read there.
Uh-huh. And this had been passed on by the Vietnamese Politburo to the Russian what? Or Soviet?
No, I don't know how it got into the archives, but based on reading a lot of other documents, a lot of other documents which were provided to the Central Committee by the Soviet military, that is, to the Soviet Central Committee by the Soviet military. I believe that the Soviet military intelligence had informers within the highest levels of the Vietnamese Communist Party. I don't believe the Vietnamese Communist Party would necessarily have given such a document, but somebody gave it to the Soviets.
Now, in addition to giving the new total of 1,205 prisoners, roughly 3 times what we thought were there, it says the prisoners were grouped politically. Would you explain that?
Yes, they were grouped according to their political orientation into what the Vietnamese called progressive, reactionary, and neutralist, according to whether they took the Vietnamese Communist line on the war, according to whether they were critical of President Nixon in the United States or not. And there were figures, numbers given out. For example, they said that 368 of the prisoners were politically progressive, and these prisoners would be released in the first instance.
And the most reactionary, to use their term, were the senior officers in the group.
Yes, not only the senior officers, but they said that all the senior officers were reactionary, within the reactionary category.
In other words, we're defending the American administration's
yes,
position
and
on the war.
didn't succumb to Vietnamese communist propaganda.
And from the copy reproduced in the New York Times today, it states frankly that Hanoi was not telling the truth. I mean, correct?
Yeah, they say very explicitly, up until now, we have only spoken of 368 prisoners. This is not the correct number. In fact, this report is very definite in saying this is the first time that I, a representative of the Vietnamese People's Army, are telling you, members of the Politburo, how many prisoners we are holding. Of course, he says at the beginning of the document, all the work that we are doing with the prisoners is under the direct supervision of the Politburo of the Communist Party of Vietnam. But this is the first time I'm giving you the actual numbers.
Now, in Hanoi, and their ambassador at the United Nations, Li Bang, says that this is a forgery, and it's a forgery designed to block improved relations. I assume you think it's authentic.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure who he thinks forged it. There was, in part of the media circus that's going on now over this issue, a commentator on CNN earlier today suggested that Boris Yeltsin and his administration forged the document, inserted it in the archives, and used me as a patsy to deliver it to the Clinton administration and the American public as a way of getting aid to Russia.
What convinces you of its authenticity?
Many things convince me of its authenticity. For example, the language. For example, the discussion. There are many other issues discussed in this document, by the way. The question of the American prisoners of war, it only comes at the end of the document. And a lot of the discussion of the approaches they had made, for example, the South Vietnamese politicians to try and get them involved in a coalition government rings very true. The analysis, the discussion of a dispatch of a team of assassins to South Vietnam. But the most important thing, I think, which convinces me this is a genuine document, is the fact that there's an accompanying document where I would call, to use American bureaucratic parlance, an executive summary, which is written and signed by the head of Soviet military intelligence, a man, Mr. Ivashutin, who was head of Soviet military intelligence for 25 years. Now, the fact that he signed off on this suggests that the Soviet leadership believed that this was an authentic Vietnamese document. And I am one who has greatest respect for the professional competence of Soviet military intelligence.
All right. Well, we'll come back. Sorry I said you were in Boston. You're not. You're in Washington. But for more analysis on past and future U.S.-Vietnamese relations, we turn to Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger was Secretary of State under Presidents Nixon and Ford. He's now chairman of Kissinger Associates Incorporated, an international consulting firm. Dr. Brzezinski was National Security Advisor under President Carter. He's now counselor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Brzezinski, you've stated publicly, and you're quoted in the New York Times as believing the document is genuine. What convinces you?
Its style, its content, the cover note to the Soviet Politburo. One would have to assume a really very complex Byzantine conspiracy to reach the conclusion that this is not an authentic Soviet document based on a Vietnamese document. I'm not prepared to argue that every detail in that document may be accurate. It was prepared, after all, under wartime conditions by the North Vietnamese, who were subjected to warfare and bombing. So this or that item, name, or figure may be wrong. But the style of the document, the numbers cited regarding Americans correspond in some important respects to our estimates, and even the categorization of the prisoners into these different ideologically described groups is part and parcel of the technique that not only the Vietnamese but the Soviets many years earlier had followed.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kissinger, you negotiated the end of this war based on, in part, on the figures you were given and had to accept at the time by the Vietnamese. What do you think on the question of authenticity, first of all, of the document?
We did not negotiate the end of the agreement on the basis of the figures because they refused to give us the figures until the agreement was completed.
Uh-huh.
And that was one of the blackmails that they constantly used against us. I have only read what it was in the New York Times, and I agree with Big that those parts that I know something about have an authentic ring. For example, when they describe what their negotiating tactics were, those were the tactics they were using in negotiating with us. Also,
would you amplify on that just a little bit?
They say in this document that their proposals were first a ceasefire and the overthrow of President Thieu, after which they would use the prisoners to negotiate whatever other concerns they had. Now, as of the date of that document, those were their proposals. A month later, they changed it. But I could see that if you make a report to the Politburo in the middle of September, and you want to summarize what the negotiating position is, this was exactly the negotiating position they had as of the date of their document.
So somebody to have forged it would have to be very ingenious and to know the changes in their position 20 years ago. And
to be precise, on October 8th, about 3 weeks after this document, they changed their position. But up to that time, they had insisted on exactly the conditions that are in that document. And they certainly wouldn't have told anybody that they were proposing to change it. That could only have been known to a very few people. Mm-hmm. And they didn't change it for another 3 to 4 weeks.
So if this is authentic, as you're suggesting it is, it suggests that
may be
that you were just blatantly lied to during these.
And every succeeding American administration, because it was not only to our administration that they gave these figures, they have consistently maintained in every administration that they that they had held no additional prisoners, and that they had given us an accurate account. They told it to us repeatedly. We had a much smaller number that we were questioning. We were questioning about 80 people where we had various reasons to believe that they had. They adamantly denied this. They've denied it to a committee of the Congress that visited there in 1975. I'm sure they denied it repeatedly to the administration in which Vic was national security advisor. It's been their permanent position that they gave us an accurate account.
Dr. Brzezinski, the New York Times quotes you as having a theory on what might have happened to the officers in question. Would you repeat it?
Well, I do so with sadness and reluctance, that I suspect that the Vietnamese had the view, as Henry indicated, that this would be a very prolonged conflict in which, at best, the United States might partially disengage from South Vietnam, but would continue supporting it, and that further leverage on the United States would be desirable for them to have, that they were surprised by the extent of our willingness to accommodate, and then by the congressional unwillingness to support South Vietnam subsequently, and thus victory came sooner and more easily than they had expected. In the meantime, they had gone on record repeatedly as having only had the number to which they admitted themselves to having, and as having no more than those that they released. And they were stuck with a situation in which they no longer needed leverage against the United States, and yet had several hundred surviving Americans, many of whom they had classified as reactionaries and therefore as enemies. And I'm therefore, knowing how the Vietnamese regime has behaved in the past, for that matter, how the Soviet regime has behaved in the past, I'm led sadly to the conclusion that in all probability, sometime after the conclusion of the Paris agreements, or perhaps after the fall of South Vietnam in 1975, they executed those that were still living, perhaps with the exception of a small number whom they retained for continuing intelligence or technical purposes.
You compared it to the massacre by the Soviets under Stalin of the Polish officer corps in the Katyn Wood. In other words, it's just a straight, deliberate execution.
Yes, because they were, in effect, in a situation of their own making. They had thought they would use these people as leverage on us, and it's hinted in that report, the document, which is now public. And they were then faced with a situation in which they no longer needed to exercise that leverage, and they had been publicly committed to the proposition that they had no more Americans, and therefore some of them might have felt, the leadership might have felt, that this is the easiest way out, and that incidentally explains the howls of outrage that are now emanating from Hanoi.
What do you think of Zbigniew Brzezinski's theory?
I have no way of judging it. If the document is authentic, then they were holding 1,200 or some 800 people more than they acknowledged 3 months before the war ended. And then they committed a violation which would, without any question, have caused us to resume the war if we had known that they had done this. And so how they disposed of the prisoners, I wouldn't begin to guess at.
But logic would impel one to believe that either they're still alive somewhere, or they were executed, or they died gradually from...
I have never understood why they would want to hold prisoners that they didn't acknowledge. So if they held prisoners that they didn't acknowledge, then there is considerable plausibility to Zbig's theory. I don't see why they would hold them for 20 years without ever using them in order to extort economic aid or whatever else.
In other words, if they'd held them and they were alive, they could have found some use for them.
Well, one would have thought that if they held them in order to blackmail us, they would have at some point produced them. Whether they thought this was no longer necessary after Saigon collapsed, and I think in fairness we have to admit to ourselves it collapsed because our Congress cut off both the ability to use military force and reduced aid by 50% in each year. Whatever the reason for the collapse was, after that they might have believed that there was no longer any negotiating tool. I'm not, the families are suffering so much in these cases, I cannot assert that they held these prisoners, but if that document is authentic, and it is hard to imagine who would have forged it for what purpose, then I think an enormous crime has been committed, and then I do not see how we can proceed in normalizing relations until this is fully cleared up.
Dr. Morris, you presented this document when you found it or you told the Clinton administration about it, National Security Council and others, but I gather from reports that they showed very little interest in it at first. Is that correct?
Well, I tried to bring it to the attention of the highest possible officials of the U.S. government because I felt that the document that I had found was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of the story. And the questions you have raised and which have been answered with the hypothesis of Dr. Brzezinski can be confirmed or denied by documents, for example, citing execution. The communists are very methodical about documenting all their actions. If they decided to execute 700 American prisoners, there will be a document ordering the execution. And I believe that, as I said before, given the close relationship between the Soviet and the Vietnamese leadership during these years, the Soviets would know about it, and there is a document in the Soviet archives. And the reason I went to the Clinton...
You're saying there should be a document?
There should be a document in the Soviet archives passed on by a Vietnamese informant to a Soviet representative in Hanoi. Now, therefore, I felt that the road to resolving this problem lies not in Hanoi, but in Moscow. And I believe that sending General Vesey is a foolish enterprise if the purpose is to find out what happened to the 700 American prisoners.
General Vesey, the retired general, is the president's special envoy to Hanoi.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think that if the president of the United States wants to express his outrage at this, there are other ways of doing it. I mean, there's a basic question he has to ask. What has happened to the 700 Americans? But if he really wants to find out, the answer will be found in the Russian archives. And that's why I went to the Clinton administration, to try and encourage them to take moves discreetly, to get the Soviets, to the Russians, I should say, to open other archives to which I don't now have access. And I felt that whilst there was great interest, for example, in the Department of Defense in seeing the document, there was no interest, or very little interest that I could see, either in Defense or in the National Security Council, in proceeding along the path that I had suggested to find the rest of the paper trail.
Dr. Brzezinski, what kind of new condition does the presence of this document create for normalizing relations with Vietnam, in your view?
Well, first of all, let me just make one comment on the Russian aspect of it. I think we have to give credit to the current Russian government for being willing to face up to the truth as far as this document is concerned. And I'm sure it wasn't easy, and I think we have to credit them for their goodwill and openness, and hopefully they'll pursue the issue further. As far as Vietnam is concerned, I think that if this document is sustained, and it looks, unfortunately, to be sustainable, we have the right to ask the present Vietnamese government to place those responsible on war crimes trials. There has been some change in the composition of that government. Communist governments have a unique capacity to rewrite past history and to condemn their predecessors. And at the very least, there should be some sort of a moral accounting, similar to the one that the Russians, for example, gave with respect to the Polish officers, when they acknowledged to the Poles ultimately that they did it, and that...
Gorbachev did that a couple of years ago.
Exactly, and that they regretted it, and it was their criminal predecessors that did it. At least some moral satisfaction is owed to the United States, and a great deal of that is owed directly to the families involved, who have suffered so much for so long, and who have so often been rebuffed, even by parts of the U.S. bureaucracy.
Dr. Kissinger, what's your view on what factor this is in the attempts to normalize relations?
Well, I don't think that we can normalize relations or ease conditions in international agencies until we have cleared up this issue. One way to do it is to ask the Russians, who deserve credit for producing this document, to produce other documents relevant to American prisoners, because they must have many more. Another one is perhaps to re-question our own prisoners, returned prisoners, to see how much of that document can be sustained from what they know. I mean, were these prisoners, do they know of any separation of prisoners and similar matters? But I don't see how we can proceed with North Vietnamese or with Vietnamese normalization until this question is cleared up. And I think if it should be, this document should be authenticated. Some of the measures that Dr. Brzezinski put forward would be very appropriate.
Well, Dr. Kissinger, Dr. Brzezinski, stay with us because we're going to move on. Judy?
Now we turn to the story in Bosnia. Today, 800 Muslims were evacuated from the town of Srebrenica, which came under Serb artillery fire on Monday. Food supplies are running low throughout the country. We have a report from eastern Bosnia by Jane Bennett-Powell of Independent Television News.
The convoy, seen here at Bratunac in Serb-held territory, was given relatively uninterrupted passage on the journey from Srebrenica, according to the UN's High Commission for Refugees tonight. A search was carried out here, but the speed of their journey indicates few delays for the evacuees. Fewer than a tenth of them are wounded, suggesting many of last night's injured are still in Srebrenica. Only 6 trucks took aid into the town, where food supplies are low and the water is thought to be infected. The fear is that rising panic may have led to another storming of the 6 trucks, which then transferred some of their human cargo to make a more comfortable journey to Tuzla. When the amateur radio operators in Tuzla last made contact with Srebrenica late last night, it was to hear how the 6,000 inhabitants and 34,000 or so refugees who are now there took hours of shelling by the Serbs who surround them. They're killing people, old and helpless persons. Since 2 o'clock this afternoon, there's been multiple killings and bombardments.
What I've heard is that especially the school, the refugee place, is hit quite severely, where about 1,000 people are living at this moment. It's also close to the hospital. I had no information how bad the hospital was damaged, but it's clear that especially that center was hit.
If Srebrenica is the most prominent instance of life under siege in Bosnia, it's not the only one. Dozens of villagers still live on the front line, staying on to defend their homes, reluctant human shields. 7 kilometers along from where the Srebrenica convoys cross into territory held by the Bosnian government, the Serbs have tried to advance and nearly cut off a pocket of land. In Jajce, sheltered to some degree by the brow of the hill, the inhabitants live on. Their fear that if they leave, the soldiers would have no will to fight on, and that the Serbs would sweep in and burn their homes. Men here say the UN Security Council, which is due to discuss the arms embargo soon, should lift it so they can fight the war on a level playing field. They're dismayed that the British Foreign Secretary, for one, has said it would merely create a level killing field. The local commander here doesn't believe it would escalate the war.
It won't. It'll just balance things out with the enemy, and it'll help to end the war more quickly. We have the will and the power and higher morale, everything to get back our territory, except weapons.
Whether more arms would end the war or merely escalate it, many Bosnians share the view of the UN Special Envoy here, that the solution to the killing in frontline villages is not to evacuate women and children, but to enforce the ceasefire.
Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski are back with us now to discuss the situation in Bosnia. Dr. Brzezinski, is there any rational explanation for this latest attack by the Serb forces on the town of Srebrenica and on Sarajevo, where you have mostly civilians with little military defense?
Well, there is a rational explanation. It's an immoral one. It's an unacceptable one, but there is. Namely, the Serbs are feeding their oats. They have concluded that the international community, the United States in the forefront, have neither the will, nor the guts, nor the motivation to take care of this problem. We're dealing here, I think, with a massive moral and geopolitical failure, an outrage, in fact, and I think the Serbs are conscious of what is happening on the ground and are exploiting it.
Dr. Kissinger, do you see it the same way?
I think what the Serbs are doing is a moral outrage. I have more difficulty trying to understand what it is that the United States is supposed to do militarily in order to resist it. And I am very uneasy about starting military operations whose nature I cannot describe and whose end result is not calculable from the statements of some of the advocates. This is my concern about military operations. If we wanted to say that we insist on a ceasefire and that we will resist any new military operation, that we will confine our actions to that, I could support this. What I would be reluctant to see is significant American ground operations in an area this far removed from the United States and for which I cannot visualize what the end would be. because having just gone through this Vietnam discussion, I do not want to see another repetition of a similar situation, but I agree completely with what Brzezinski said, that what the Serbs are doing is a moral and human outrage.
Well, since you've gone ahead and brought up the prospect of the discussion of the potential use of U.S. military force, is that the only thing? Is outside military force, in your view, the only thing that could stop the course of events over there now?
You know, actually, I believe that the United States and Western Europe together have taken a tough stance and indicated a willingness to use force. The Serbs would have backed off.
Earlier on.
Yes, because there is not unanimity in Serbia on behalf of the war. Significant segments of Serbian population are uneasy, troubled, and worried. But we didn't do that. Now, can we do it now? The political fact is that there's no willingness in the United States to do it, nor in Europe. And therefore, in that context, attempting to put American troops in probably doesn't make much sense. But this doesn't mean that we couldn't do some other things, which would be at least partial responses. One, really enforce the no-fly zone. This present attempt at enforcement, so much delayed, is really a joke if you look at the rules of engagement. Two, we should put troops in now into Macedonia and Kosovo, or in Albania next to Kosovo, to avoid the spread of the war.
These are other provinces of the former Yugoslavia.
Exactly. And three, we should provide arms, lift the embargo on the Bosnians. When the British Secretary says...
But do you really believe at this late date that those actions would make a difference?
Yes, they are asking for it. You know, during World War II, we provided arms to resistance movements in Europe that we failed to provide it to the Jews. And we didn't expect them to defeat the Nazis, but we felt they at least had a chance and the right to defend themselves. And the Bosnians are convinced that they had arms that would do better. The Croats have had access to arms, and in the last year, the Croatian-Serbian situation has become more stable.
Dr. Kissinger, do you think the steps that Dr. Brzezinski is describing would make a real difference at this point?
Well, I recommended last September that unless there were an immediate ceasefire, that the arms embargo should be lifted. So this is a step that I favor. I favor enforcement of the no-flight zone and the strictest military embargo that could be carried out. And at some point, we should consider breaking diplomatic relations with Yugoslavia if these measures continue. My opposition is to ground forces and open-ended military action.
But meanwhile...
On this we seem to agree, actually.
But meanwhile, you have the continued killing of so many people, most of them civilians, in many of these towns in eastern Bosnia, not just Srebrenica, but Sarajevo continues to be under attack. Is there anything that can be done just from a humanitarian standpoint for these people, or is that just idealistic thinking on the part of some Americans who are concerned?
Is that question addressed to me?
To you, yes.
Great efforts have been made for humanitarian assistance, and I cannot think of any additional humanitarian aid that can be given, although obviously as many supplies as we can get in there should be done. It seems to me that what the Serbs are trying to do is to take all contiguous areas and to shrink the Muslim area to the smallest dimensions possible and maybe eliminate it altogether. And this produces extraordinary suffering. And I don't think it can be dealt with by humanitarian aid alone.
What about this question, Dr. Brzezinski, of is there anything else that can be done from a humanitarian standpoint? I mean, you're talking about strictly enforcing the no-fly zone.
Sure, you know, we could increase our airdrops. We could increase the amount of food or medicine that's being shipped in. Because they're running low on it, and the West Europeans are not providing enough. And for that matter, we aren't providing enough. But this would be like dropping food packages into Auschwitz. I think the issue has to be faced. A people is being slaughtered, a country is being overrun, and not just anywhere, but in the heart of Europe, that part of humanity which allegedly is subject to some degree of international legitimacy, and the powers to be, the United States, Western Europe, are watching it. I consider this to be a failure that's bipartisan in nature. The Bush administration didn't respond. The Clinton administration, in spite of its noises during the campaign, is not responding, and therefore this is a failure of all of us. And we don't have to intervene massively with American soldiers to be doing something. We could be doing more along the lines of the three-pronged approach that I have advocated.
And just recently you've had the Clinton administration urging the United Nations to put off a vote on sanctions against Serbia until Yeltsin's fate is determined.
So
is that the right priority?
Well, in effect, we're propitiating Yeltsin on this issue, having lost a great deal of time, because in the past the Russians were far more malleable than they are today. They'll be less malleable in the future. The problem's not going to be easier to solve. And in the meantime, we're establishing a terrible international precedent for ethnic cleansing and for the unilateral use of force.
Is this a terrible precedent, Dr. Kissinger, for this sort of solution to take place when there are territorial or in-country disputes like this one in the future, whether it's in Europe or the former Soviet Union?
I think it is. It could turn, yes, it probably already is a bad precedent. I think what is needed is for the United States to state comprehensively what it wants and what it is willing to do. I do not believe that little measures like increasing the air drafts or doing individual stopgap measures are going to be able to deal with this problem. We have to put forward some comprehensive requirement of what we want. And what we really want is an end to military operations. If that can be achieved, then the humanitarian, the increase in humanitarian aid is relatively easy. The Serbs would gain from this what they have already conquered, but at least the killing would stop.
I'm sorry, you said if all that would happen if the United States would state an
I think we should say that we will break diplomatic relations with Yugoslavia, that we will blockade the former Yugoslavia, that is Belgrade, that we will blockade the country, that we invite immediately the creation by NATO of some military command that will try to enforce a ceasefire and to enforce the no-flight zone. If we try to create that military command, incidentally, we will see who shows up, and I don't think there will be all that many. But we should not create the impression that American ground forces can be used.
But just quickly, Dr. Brzezinski, is that going to make a difference this late, the kind of thing Dr. Kissinger's recommended?
Well, if we were willing to do it, it would make a difference. But I'm not sure we're willing to do it. But because we're not willing to do that, it doesn't mean we should do nothing. And I think if we were at least willing to give the Bosnians a better chance of fighting, it would increase the pressure on the Serbs to accommodate, because the Serbs are not omnipotent. They have several fronts in which to fight, and a more effective resistance would create some sort of a stalemate on the ground.
Well, Dr. Brzezinski, Dr. Kissinger, thank you both for being with us.
Next tonight, the response inside South Africa to the weekend murder of one of that country's principal black leaders, Chris Hani. Hani, a former official of the African National Congress and General Secretary of the Communist Party, was shot to death on Sunday. A white man has been charged. Now, both the white government and the African National Congress are trying to contain the anger among the country's majority black population. Nelson Mandela warned that the country was on the brink of disaster. We have a report from Judy Aslett of Independent Television News.
The anger generated by the murder of Chris Hani is already gaining momentum. Outside Boksburg Magistrates Court this morning, where Hani's alleged killer made his first appearance, thousands of protesters were matched by an unprecedented police presence. As the armed convoy left, taking Jan Valus back to jail, the focus of that anger was against the government. As more details of who Chris Hani's killer was are uncovered, the ANC leadership is convinced the man was not acting alone and must have had connections with the security forces.
This killer was issued with a submachine gun, according to the police. He has got a license for that. In terms of law in this country, no civilian is supposed to be having that type of an arm. Who authorized this man to carry that weapon? Is he not part of the special forces?
Another link with the security forces is that the gun the police say was used to kill Chris Hani came from this cache, stolen 3 years ago from the South African Air Force headquarters. At the time, Chris Hani was critical of how easy it had been for right-wingers to get hold of the guns.
Either this man himself stole the weapons, in which case he's got contacts who opened up for him at the Air Force base. If he didn't do it, who did it for him?
It's unavoidable, I think, that suspicions are going to be cast on institutions within the state, regardless of whether the government itself was involved or not. And it's going to be extremely difficult for the government to completely reject all of those accusations that people have already made.
Tonight, though, the government is continuing to deny that they had anything to do with Chris Hani's murder.
Insofar as the allegation concerning the government is concerned, there we categorically state that we have not, as a government, been involved in any conspiracy.
In the townships, any denial from the government is already falling on deaf ears. Last night, news in the Eastern Cape threw petrol bombs at police Caspers. Burning roadblocks also warn outsiders, particularly whites, that they're not welcome in the area. It's this anti-white feeling that the ANC leadership is trying to contain. The most volatile group is the ANC Youth League, who've been holding rallies and marches for the past 3 days. Many of them now feel that talks with the government should be called off.
I think it would be very, very wise for the African National Congress to suspend or to pull out totally and completely from negotiations. I think now is the time where we, the African National Congress Youth League, would stand up and fight the enemy. We are going to have the state responsible for it because we feel that they are cheating at us. We are negotiating at the same time they are killing us.
Despite the ANC leadership's calls for calm, it's clear the militant wing of the ANC is gaining strength. The pressure now is on the leadership to recognize that anger and channel it into organized marches and protests. In the past, Chris Hani was seen as the one man in the leadership of the ANC who could keep the youth wing under control. His peculiar mixture of being the long-time head of the ANC army in Nkonto Sizwe, as well as a key negotiator, made him the link between the militants and those involved with the reform process. With his death, the ANC lost that vital link, and many now feel the organization will have to change in order to keep the youth on side.
One of the mistakes that we have made as an organization was to elevate negotiations and not to take care of other pillars of struggle, like the pillar of mass action. It has been missing, and it has been used like a tap of water. That is one of the major mistakes that we as ANC have made. And the death of Comrade Suzanne should mean that we change that kind of an approach.
Already there are plans for more mass action, with a national stay-away set for tomorrow. The test now is whether Mr. Mandela, tonight meeting Chris Hani's father, can keep those protests peaceful.
Finally tonight, essayist Amai Wallach, art critic for New York Newsday, reports on 2 New York exhibits which have different views of what is art.
Is this videotape footage art? And is George Holliday, the man who shot it, an artist? New York's Whitney Museum of American Art says yes. Can you make a work of art out of a subject like wife beating? Or skin color? How about phone sex? Stick in a quarter and dial into someone's fantasy. For some time now, people who call themselves artists have been trying to make art out of subjects like these. Take this year's Whitney Biennial. Ever since the Whitney inaugurated its every 2-year survey of what's hot in contemporary art 60 years ago, it's been notoriously controversial, but never has it so self-consciously invited outrage as this year. The Whitney has transplanted from the margins of society to the art world's equivalent of Broadway, a kind of socially engaged, in-your-face art by women, Hispanics, homosexuals, the disenfranchised who are mad about something and they aren't going to take it anymore. You begin to get the message the minute you pay your money and put on your admissions button, designed by artist Daniel J. Martinez. This survey of art of the last 2 years comes out of a world in which the economy staggered, Los Angeles burned, and the art market collapsed. And through video, sculpture, installations, and photography, these artists are engaging the same tough issues that have focused the attention of politicians and talk show hosts. So the question is, can art show us anything we haven't already seen on Oprah Winfrey? Maybe. Maybe Pepon Osorio really can introduce us into the heart of the Hispanic dream with his Baroque fantasy of a living room and dining room in which a murder has been committed. Shelves of videos outside the room remind us of the violent movie stereotypes of Hispanics to compare with this richly imagined and observed reality. Maybe the wily and erudite Cherokee activist Jimmy Durham really can make us rethink our disdainful romanticizing of the noble savage. He's constructed witty sculptures out of hybrids of Coke bottles, engine parts, industrial hoses that he's assembled to suggest guns and cannons, but also fetishes, fertility symbols, in other words, primitive souvenirs. But what about that Rodney King footage? It certainly changed our world, if that's what art's meant to do. And the documentary video in the exhibition, which uses it repeatedly, certainly demonstrates why and how. But can a documentary, no matter how persuasive and enlightening, be considered art? For hundreds of years in the West, with time out for the Middle Ages, there had been a consensus about what constituted art. It had been defined in what was considered its finest hour, in 5th century Athens, when the Critios boy took art's first breathtakingly natural step into one of the first great moments of Western civilization. Before him, statues stood stiff and distantly godlike in the Egyptian manner. Slowly they developed the muscles, the weight of a leg that could come only from interested study of the human body, until the Critios boy strode into a new age that was focused on man, not gods. By a happy coincidence, the Critios boy is currently on view in New York at the Metropolitan Museum, just up the street from the Whitney Biennial, in a lone show from Greece called The Greek Miracle. The Greek miracle, a term which itself has lately come under scholarly attack, was democracy. The Critios boy and what came next were perfect visual expressions of the idea on which democracy was built. It was an idea that said that the key to existence lay in a knowledge of the mind and spirit of man, not in the contemplation of abstract, unknowable spiritual forces. Even then, the idea was riddled with as many contradictions as Athens' own imperialistic democracy. But the concept endured. And after the Renaissance, it became the standard of European art, until the 20th century began to invite in other ideas from Africa, the Far East, and the Americas. Even now, though, with Western civilization on the defensive, the Critios boy has something to teach us about the definition of art, and the definition turns out to be the same for every culture and every age. A great, even a successful work of art is one in which an idea has found its perfect visual form. Marble may not be the perfect medium in which to express ideas about our disoriented, dysfunctional, dizzyingly shifting world. Does that mean that George Holliday's home video is? You decide. I'm Amai Wallace.
Once again, the main stories of this Tuesday. A United Nations aid convoy evacuated 800 Muslim refugees from the Bosnian town of Srebrenica. They included dozens who were wounded when Serb shells pounded the town yesterday. At least 56 people were killed in the attack. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Judy. That's the NewsHour tonight, and we'll be back with you tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. PepsiCo. Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the NewsHour is also provided by AT&T and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
I'm Nancy Marshall with OPB Radio. Tomorrow morning from 5 to 9 on OPB Radio, it's Morning Edition. Tomorrow we discuss the differing approaches of the U.S. and Japan toward intervention in their economies. That's tomorrow morning on OPB Radio.
Of the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS1. This is PBS.
Funding for this evening's broadcast of MacNeil Lehrer has been provided by Norm Thompson Outfitters, Oregon's escape from the ordinary for apparel and gifts. Norm Thompson, located at the airport and in Northwest Portland. And by PACC Health Plans. In the forefront of managed health care, PACC offers a wide range of solutions for businesses, both large and small.
If there's no snow, how can there...
Coffee, too. Rudy Tooty Fresh and Fruity Breakfast Special. Only $2.99 at your IHOP now.
Join us later tonight for Newsroom 6 at 11. Some encouraging news to report tonight about women and menopause. A new treatment is helping lots of women feel better. It may also help them live longer. But there are risks, and we'll tell you the pros and cons. Also tonight, Ed Whalen will save all the great plays from sports and Randy's up-to-the-minute forecast. See you at 11.
It's time for spring cleaning. Time to scrub away the grime, making certain that that family vehicle is shiny and bright.
Which led Ray Summers to a place along Southeast Division.
I bought all his old 64 Chevrolet SS spinners. I probably got about 10 sets of them in stock now.
You can't sell it if you don't have it. Dick McGowick knows that is true.
Like 1 day a week. Hubcap World.
Even for hubcaps. Heaven knows he has plenty of them.
Back here we got a Pontiac room.
A Pontiac room and a foreign car wing. And every year a passel of new hubcaps to add to the old.
I'm running out of room already. Started out with 1,000 square feet 7 years ago, and I'm got 4,000 square feet now, and I'm just about out of room.
A businessman's lament.
Chrysler, 14-inch. How nice the one you want? You do have a center?
See the one that's on it.
You do have a center for it, or you need center too? You're probably looking at about $50 for just the wheel cover.
If you haven't priced wheel covers since you were a teenager, you may be surprised.
Older people think that they're still going to a wrecking yard and buying them for $5 and $10. That's a thing of the past.
Of course, a thing of the past is what some people want.
I had a call for a 37 Dodge pickup truck the other day. Didn't know for sure what it really looked like, but I had a Dodge right above the door. I pulled it down, he said, like this, and he says, hey, that's the right one.
Dick McGowick started years ago with a wrecking yard. The wrecking yard is gone, now just hubcaps.
Studebakers, Packards, a little bit of everything.
Spring is good. People wash cars, find a wheel cover missing.
And then they start looking for me.
Even people with Rolls Royces.
It's a good game. There's a lot of people out there who need hubcaps.
It's enough to keep a fellow busy.
Yes, I do. I have some nice ones for $35 a piece.
Ray Summers at Large with photographer John Keller, Southeast Portland.
Some of those hubcaps he showed us will bring more than $100.
Is that right?
They tell me. McGavick sells hubcaps with scratches and dents to the recyclers, and he washes and polishes the good one, and he puts them up for sale.
And Ray tells us that some people actually buy them for wall decorations, something to remind them of a car they owned 40 years ago or so.
Cherish that Chevy. Randy, a quick 4-day, 5-day forecast?
Well, the 3-hour forecast calls for rain, and then beyond that, we get into a pattern where the rain ends, and then it begins again, and then it begins, or ends. Which one did I leave off with? Well, you get the picture. It's going to be raining on and off through the weekend. It's a staggering forecast. Hard to comprehend for me.
We need 2 or 3 rain gauges to handle all that.
We'll see what you have to say at 11, too. Hope you'll join us then. Good night.